Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna Wittenberg and K.S. Barton each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 25, in which Johanna and I have the pleasure of speaking with science writer Heather Pringle. I'm K.S. Barton, the author of the Norse family trilogy, in which a young Viking woman and a Viking warrior are caught in a deadly blood feud between two brothers. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm great.
Good. I'm Johanna Wittenberg, author of the Northwomen series, which is the story of a real Norse queen who ruled alone in the early Viking Age. And with me is our special guest, Heather Pringle. Heather is a Canadian writer who specializes in writing about the distant past. Her work often takes her out of the way places and leads to memorable encounters with both the living and the dead, subjects that inspire her writing. Heather has written for National Geographic, Scientific American, Archaeology, and many other leading magazines over the course of her career. Her work has been anthologized in the best American science and nature writing. She has 5 nonfiction books that explore the past in diverse ways. The latest, and my favorite, entitled The Northwomen, Stories from the Other Half of the Viking World, was published by National Geographic Books in September of 2024. And I must say, I loved that book. I really, it's just bristling with Post-it flags.
And I have to say, I love the subtitle, Stories from the Other Half of the Viking World.
Or maybe the better half.
That was what I was thinking too, but I thought, no, we can't actually put that on the cover. But I
No, I might raise some eyebrows.
Yes, exactly.
And Heather is currently working on her first novel, which we will talk about at the end. But now I'd like to welcome you, Heather, and please tell us a little bit about your journey as a writer.
Well, thank you very much for that really lovely introduction. I don't know how much I have to add to that, really. I started working as a freelance writer back in the early 1980s, so that's about 4 decades ago. And for almost my entire career, I've been writing about covering the field of archaeology and history. And I have a deep love and passion for those subjects. And throughout that career, I've been very interested in what archaeology tells us about the lives of ordinary people in the past and the lives of women in the past. I've been really interested in that too. So I've written, for example, about women in the Paleolithic period in Europe who were hunters. And so they weren't following the traditional gender roles that one might think of, but they were actually hunting game with what appeared to be woven nets. And I also have written about female gladiators at one point too. I did a story for Discover magazine, an article for Discover magazine on that. So I've had quite a long career doing this, and I have a great interest in archaeology and in what it tells us about women's lives in the past. So that's really, in a nutshell, my writing career.
So before we get to the book, I want to bring up your 2017 Vikings for National Geographic. And I was before we were recording, I was telling Heather that I dug it out and I was looking through it again, looking at the pictures and everything. One of the things I was struck by, because I think it really, rang true for me, is the very last paragraph in this article. And I'm going to quote it if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah,
All right.
by all means.
The idea of the Vikings, The romance of these intrepid northerners who built great ships and sailed ice-choked seas to a new world and winding rivers to the bazaars of the East never grows old, never grows tired. It lives on here and across their northern realm, a message from a long-dead world, an enduring spirit of an age. And it rings really true for me because clearly it's enduring enough that I'm writing books about it, Johanna as well. So I just love that enduring
Oh,
spirit.
thank you. Yeah.
And is that what maybe drew you to write a book about women of the Viking Age?
Well, I felt like, I mean, I when I wrote the text for that, for the Viking article, and also I did a longer book, sort of what National Geographic calls a bookazine. So it's a hybrid, and it looks like a National Geographic magazine. It's a little bit bigger in format, but all the text is written by one writer. So I've done that as well. And that sparked, I mean, that both those projects really sparked my interest in the Vikings, although I should mention, written about the Vikings even before that. But it really kind of sparked my interest. And while I was doing the research for that, I paid a visit to Oslo, and went to what was then called the Viking Ship Museum. It's now being rebranded as Museum of the Viking Age, but nevertheless, it's a museum in Oslo where they have these enormous, authentic Viking ships, and they are in a museum setting. So they've been brought up out of the water and inside, so you can really have a good look at them. And one of those ships was the Oseberg, the ship that was in the Oseberg burial. And I was just blown away by this ship. I mean, it's almost complete. And it's the ship itself is a work of art. It's carved with intricate carvings by master wood carvers. And it was actually discovered by archaeologists in a ship burial. So the ship was towed onto land and then used basically as a coffin for a funeral ceremony. And the mourners filled the ship with treasures, tapestries, all kinds of stuff. And a lot of very expensive things, carved carriages and so on. But they also placed the bodies of two individuals in that ship. And subsequent research showed that those two individuals were women. And this is the most lavish grave that we know about from the entire Viking world. And this grave was the grave of two women. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting to me because when I think about the Vikings often, I think about this world that's sort of steeped in testosterone. I mean, it's just, it's a very kind of hyper masculine world. And yet here we have this burial of these two women. And oh my gosh, it's the most lavish burial that we know of. So this started raising a lot of questions in my mind. I thought, well, maybe I should look into the lives a little bit more into the lives of Viking women. Wouldn't that be interesting and fun? I thought I would look into this. So that's really the origin stories of this book.
We'll talk more about the Oseberg in a minute because that is one of my favorite subjects. I've been there 3 times and I love that ship.
Yeah.
But in the Northwomen, you explore every aspect of women in the Viking Age that can be imagined. I mean, I thought I had read everything about them, but you brought up an awful lot in that book that I had not thought of, things that I really may have been peripherally aware of, but not really you put things together in a different way. And I really appreciated that. You talk about queens and slaves and everyone in between in a way that really makes it real to the reader. So do you have a favorite topic on Viking Age women or one that drew you the most? I mean, maybe the Oseberg, I don't know.
Well, Oseberg I do love, but I have to say the one that drew me the most, I think, was the subject of the warrior women, because to me it was sort of the most counterintuitive in many respects. Poets from the Viking Age really present this horrific picture of Viking warfare. They use kennings, these phrases to describe what it was like to be, on the battlefield. And they use things like weapon thunder and spear storms and army reddening. Oh, I thought that was just terrific. It just evokes this image of all these men lying dead on the field afterwards with their, terrible wounds and so on. And it just seemed to me, and it struck a lot of people for that this was really not a place for women. That women with their smaller bodies and physiques and maybe not quite as muscular, or certainly not as driven by testosterone, maybe this isn't a place for women kind of thing. But the research that I came upon when I started really looking into this subject showed that, in fact, a few women, maybe not a lot of women, but there were a few women warriors at the time. And that to me, I was so kind of fascinated by that subject, I have to say. And I really did quite a lot of research on that subject, along with many other areas that interested me. But I think that was one of my favorite.
So when you were doing all this research and interviewing people, were there any challenges that you faced or
Oh man, there sure were. Yes, there were challenges. There were a lot of them, actually. I mean, a lot of the challenges lay in the source material itself. I mean,
Mhm.
have available to us today. So the Vikings themselves, and this should be said right from the outset, didn't leave us a rich historical record themselves. So the Vikings tended to be masters, what I like to think of as masters of the spoken word as opposed to the written word. They loved to tell stories and they were great storytellers. They did have a system of writing, but that system of writing was really well adapted to short messages. So runic writing, carving runes on stone or scratching them into pieces of wood and so on. And so the runic writing that we have from the Vikings tends to be very short. It tends to be about the length of a tweet. And so,
Mhm.
it's just a little short message often. And so we don't have any, books that were written by the Vikings telling us what their society was like. We don't have that. We don't have any diaries by Viking women. Like that is often a really great resource in other medieval societies. We don't have that for the Vikings. We do have another source, another really interesting source, which is the sagas. Those are stories that were handed down by Viking storytellers over a period of, a long period of time, centuries. We're talking centuries here, one generation to another. And then they were subsequently written down a century or two after the Viking Age ended by usually Christian monks. So, and the sagas contain all kinds of things like histories of royal houses, mythology, tell us a lot about Norse mythology, and it also just stories, really cool, rich stories. And for years, saga specialists have struggled to, determine what is fact and sort of what is fiction. Where does the storytelling, the creative storytelling end, and where does the factual stuff begin? And it's a huge debate, and it's a difficult thing to kind of tease out one from the other. So in the sagas, we have stories about, women warriors, and we have stories about, very prominent women in Viking society. But the question is, are those, fictional, creative stories, or are they rooted in fact and reality? So that's a big challenge. And then the third source that we have for material about Viking women is archaeology. And it's sort of my favorite because, you can excavate, let's say, the burial of a Viking woman, and you can start to get some, what I like to think of as concrete facts, concrete pieces of evidence about a woman, or excavating a Viking settlement, and we can see, for example, weaving sheds where women spent a lot of their time, and we get a good sense of what a woman's life might have been like inside these weaving sheds. So we get concrete pieces of evidence. Now, the thing about archaeology, and here's where the challenge comes in, is that you have to be able to interpret this evidence. And archaeologists don't always agree on these interpretations like there's, So it's challenging to try to assess, what is reliable, what isn't reliable, and to try to create a good solid picture that is based on the best evidence that we have. And often I used multiple lines of evidence. I used evidence from the sagas that could be sort of verified by archaeological evidence, and I also on occasion used some evidence from the runic inscriptions as well. So we have sources, but each of the sources is challenging, very challenging.
Mhm. Was there anything that was unusual that you used as a resource or anything like that that you can think of? Like, oh, that
Uh,
was just like kind of off the beaten track
no, well,
that
I
you've
don't know.
came
I mean,
across?
I did, I interviewed researchers, so I interviewed the people that I viewed as the leading, some of the leading Viking specialists. I traveled to Scandinavia, I traveled to the sites. People took me into the field to see their research site. So I was able to see the site of a Viking settlement in Russia along one of the
Mm.
main rivers. And, so I got out in the field. So, I tried to blend all this information. I tried to distill it and to create what I thought was, the best possible portrait I could provide. So,
Well,
That must have been really a really fun thing to do. I'm thinking, oh, that would be so great to be taken to some of these places and talking with people like that. Yeah, that would be really great.
oh no, it was kind of a dream come true, really. It was. And to see the artifacts, I mean, in Russia, for example, I was in the State Historical Museum in Moscow. This is before the Ukraine war. And I was in there and the archaeologist was pulling open drawers. There was a big cabinet behind her and she was just pulling open drawers and saying, oh, this is what we found at, this site. And she would be pulling out, the big brooches that women would have been wearing. And it was just like, oh my gosh, to actually see this. And I wasn't actually touching it.
Hmm.
I don't believe in touching the artifacts, but I was looking at them and just had a wonderful experience with that. So yeah, there were great moments on this.
well, you open the Northwomen with a tantalizing description of what the Oseberg burial ceremony must have been like. And that, obviously reflects your research and your understanding of the time period. Tell us more about your research into Oseberg because that's my favorite.
Well, I have to say that, I mean, I spent a lot of time in the Viking Ship Museum, looking at the artifacts, kind of studying them, thinking about them. That was part of it. But I also spent a lot of time talking to researchers, some of the researchers who had studied various aspects of the Oseberg ship and the burial finds. And then I really delved deeply into the scientific literature and really kind of poured over papers about some of the burial finds, which were really fascinating. I mean, the ship is kind of a repository of household goods from an elite household. So we have a lot of the domestic kinds of finds, things that would have been used at the dinner table and so on. But we also have, tapestries. I mean, there were in the ship these incredible tapestries that would have been hung on the halls of the great of the on the walls, pardon me, of the great halls of the Great Hall, and just very remnants of clothing, pieces of silk that would have formed the trim on some of the clothing of the Oseberg women. And that silk came from China. I mean, just all kinds of objects in that ship that start to build a picture of who these women were. And then in addition, this is something that really fascinated me, we had the skeletal remains of the two women as well. And there have been a lot of studies over, a period of almost 100, more than 100 years actually, of studies on these human remains, these skeletal remains. And so the picture that we have today, what it shows us is that one of the women died probably around the age of 50. We have less information about her because we have fewer pieces of her skeleton that were available to researchers to analyze. But we have a more detailed skeletal collection from the second woman who died at an older age. She was about 80 years of age when she died, which is to me amazing because a lot of Viking women died before the age of 40. Most Viking women died before the age of 40. And yet here's this woman, 80-year-old woman, and she's a very unusual woman in her appearance, very unusual. She would have been, she suffered from a genetic disorder that led to obesity, often leads to obesity, and it often leads to the development of secondary male sex characteristics. So let's say facial hair, for example, and this woman may have had a beard or a mustache, let's say, kind of portly in appearance. She may have had a deep masculine voice, another secondary male characteristic. And so, in other words, she may have appeared to be someone who was, kind of a hybrid between a man and a woman. I mean, that's sort of how I'm thinking about her. She was just unusual, and this may have seemed otherworldly to a Viking community, that this woman had been set apart and she was different. And it seems to me that she may have been a sorceress. There is evidence that suggests that, and I don't know if you would like me to talk about that.
Absolutely. That was
Yes.
my next question. My next question is that your first chapter is all about sorceresses, and you describe clues on the Oseberg ship that point to sorcery and the power these women may have had. So I definitely want
Okay.
you to
Okay.
tell us.
Okay. Well, on the Oseberg ship, there was in the burial chamber. I mean, the archaeologist. The ship, was excavated around the turn of the 19th century. So I think it was 1903, but it was very carefully excavated by a team of archaeologists from Oslo. And they kept very detailed records on what they were doing, and they kept photographic records too. So they took photographs, they documented things pretty carefully. In the burial chamber, they found this oak chest, unusual chest too, I gotta say, with kind of metal studs on it. But inside, they found this slender wooden rod, very finely worked, highly polished, and it was unusual. Now, there is a researcher by the name of Neil Price, who is a very, a leading Viking specialist at Uppsala University. He teaches archaeology in the Department of Archaeology there. And he's done just a very thorough, detailed study of magic and sorcery in the Viking world. And he got interested by reading the sagas and all their descriptions of magic and sorceresses who perform magical ceremonies of all sorts, domestic magic. So they might be able to look into the future and tell you whether, there's going to be rain in the summer and your wheat crop will be fine. So there was sort of domestic magic, but they could also perform a very powerful kind of magic, which was battle magic. And they were said to be able to influence the course of a battle, so they could bring victory to one Viking lord and defeat to another foreign lord, let's say. So these women were, and magic was the province of women because the men felt that to practice magic was that using magic as a weapon was an unfair advantage on the battlefield, and it wasn't kosher to use magic on the battlefield for a man, but it was perfectly acceptable for a woman to be a sorceress and to practice magic on the battlefield. So most of the sorceresses, almost all of the sorceresses in the sagas are women. There are descriptions of these sorceresses, what they wore, and the tools of their trade, so to speak. And so we have a really great one from the saga of Eric the Red. And in that, there is a magic worker, a seeress, who is invited to a farm to help farmers who are going through a famine. And she arrives and she's dressed in a really unusual outfit. She's got this cloak on that has gems down to her feet. She's got shoes on with little tinkling bells and so on. And she carries a staff with her, and there's a description of the staff. And the word for sorceress in Old Norse actually means staff bearer. So these staffs are really important. We know that from the sagas and from other sources that these that sorceresses were equipped with these staffs, and they use them sometimes in their magical ceremonies. And so when Neil Price was started, he drew up a list of things that you might find in a sorceress grave. The staffs were number one. If you could find a staff in the burial of a woman, that was usually a pretty good indication that she was a sorceress. And then there were also other indications, unusual clothing, for example, mind-altering drugs that might help a sorceress reach a trance state during her rituals, leather pouches with magical amulets inside them. That was another way that sorceresses would dress and so on. So there were several kinds of clues that might be found in a woman's grave that might point to the idea that she was a sorceress. And in the Oseberg ship, we have the rod. It's a special kind of sorceress's rod. It appears to be this wooden one, appears to be the type that very powerful sorceresses would use, or their assistants would use, to basically tame or break the human will. And so it was a terrible weapon. It was a terrible weapon to use in sorcery. But yet that's what we find in the Oseberg ship. And then we also, the archaeologists in 1903 recovered cannabis seeds from the burial chamber. And so these again are mind-altering drugs. And this was something that, this was another clue to sorcery. The ship was moored in the grave. So the ship was actually anchored in the grave. There were ropes tying it to a huge boulder. That ship wasn't going anywhere. And that seems to be because there was a belief in the Old Norse world that sorceresses, dead sorceresses in particular, were very powerful. They could see further into the future, more clearly into the future than even a divinity could. So, it was clearly in the interest of a community to keep a powerful sorceress with them and not let her travel, into the next world kind of thing. So that ship was moored into that grave. So that seems to be an indication of sorcery. So we have several clues that kind of add up to this picture. And Neil Price drew up a list of 10 burials that he thought could be recently identified as the burials of a sorceress, and the Oseberg grave was one of those, one of the 10.
It makes me, is it in Voluspa when Odin goes to visit the sorceress to get all the information about the beginning of the world and the end of the world? And
yeah, exactly. And Balder too. Balder starts having these terrible dreams about death, and so Odin travels in disguise seeks out a dead sorceress to tell him what's going on. So anyway, yes.
I'm always fascinated by their beliefs about the dead. That it's so different than the Judeo-Christian belief. Like their bodies are actually still there, and you can just go talk to them, or you can go, a hero or heroine like Hervor could go into the burial mound and talk to whoever is dead. It's really a fascinating part of their belief system for me. Like, and I've never heard that whole idea of keeping your sorceress close so you can, even after she's dead, she's still there. It's a really interesting way of looking at the world.
Yes, it is. I agree with you. And it's I'm sure that in Christian times this was very, this would have been highly frowned upon, but in
Well, the Icelandic law book, the Grey Goose law book, they do say they outlaw sitting out and waking up the trolls. So that's
Uh-huh.
Utaseta, which is
Yeah,
a form of magic. And, they used to sit on
yeah,
grave mounds, for example, and call on the dead or
sure.
other magical, because troll kind of encompasses this whole magical realm of different kinds of beings. So, yeah, it was actually written in the law book that it was illegal to do that.
Yeah. Well,
Mm-hmm.
wasn't it Hervor that goes to that island and
Hmm.
she wants to find her father's sword? And it's just like it's just an incredible description, very ghoulish too.
Mm-hmm.
Very.
Yeah, very ghoulish. And yet here's this brave woman who wants, is determined to get her father's sword, and she's going to brave, whatever. In fact, I think the men on her ship don't want to land on the island. She's the only one that's willing to go.
And they abandoned her on the
Mm-hmm.
island too.
That's
Afterwards, they
right.
fled because
Yeah,
there was fire coming out of the grave mounds and
yeah, yeah,
Well, yeah, and even her father warns her after she starts
right.
talking to him. He's just like, "You don't want this, go away." This
yeah.
is too much. And she's just, "Nope, this is what I want. I want this sword, and you're going to give it to me."
Yes,
Yeah,
the true Viking spirit embodied.
yeah. No,
Yeah,
it is exactly.
that's true. So we've got sorceresses and warriors. So Viking women were also extremely accomplished weavers.
Yeah.
So you wrote about weaving in your book as well. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's interesting because when I first thought about the book, I thought I wasn't too interested in the weaving because I just wasn't. I have to say I'm not a very handicrafty kind of person, and so the thought of really spending time delving into that didn't initially appeal to me. But when I started actually reading about the weaving and about shipbuilding, some experiments that have been conducted at the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, Denmark. That's a different ship museum, but they do all this experimental archaeology to construct accurate replicas of Viking ships. And this project's been going on for decades now, but they also they replicate the construction of these huge sails that are on Viking ships. I mean, if you've seen a replica, you know how big some of these sails can be. Some of them are about the area of 20 king-size beds. If you were to push them all together, that's the
Wow.
area that we're talking about. And those sails were often made out of wool, and they were made by women. I mean, very, very skilled women, wool workers. And so, I started getting interested in this, and some of the replication experiments that the Viking, experimental archaeology projects that the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde was doing, they actually brought in textile experts from Norway. One of them, Amy Lightfoot, is just one of the most interesting people I interviewed during my entire research. But she was sort of heading up one of the teams that was making one of these huge sails. The amount of work that went into this was just phenomenal. It was all done by hand or, by very simple technology, a spindle wheel that you spun by hand and a horizontal loom, very, very simple technology. And the experiments from the Viking Ship Museum kind of give us estimates now of how much women's labor was involved in making sails. And that could amount to, for one large warship, one sail could amount to 10,269 hours of labor, at least. At least.
Wow.
And that doesn't include rounding up the sheep and plucking the sheep by hand. That doesn't include any of that. It's just from spinning to finished sail. So it's just mind-boggling how much work women put into this. I mean, they were absolutely critical to the success of Viking explorations, raiding parties, Viking armies that were on the move and so on. They all traveled by ship, and those sails were all made by women. In addition, the women provide all the other textiles on the ships too. So they clothe the seafarers. They created sea blankets, these big, heavy sea blankets that were kind of like shag rugs. I mean, I was just amazed. Very, very heavy sea blankets to keep men, to keep seafarers warm at night. And they also may have created some of the armor that, well, they probably did create some cloth armor for the poorer Viking warriors. So, the rich warriors had chainmail, although there are a lot of disadvantages to chainmail. It was heavy, and it rusted. And it rusted. And that wasn't really great. But the poorer guys, they had cloth armor that was made of multiple layers of cloth, sometimes 30 layers of wool cloth that was all quilted together. And some modern experiments show that this kind of armor was effective for an arrow shot from, a fairly, not a huge distance, but, a reasonable distance. And some of the arrows were bouncing off targets, bull targets on a target range that had patches of these big patches of this quilted cloth. So this cloth was effective up to a point. And so the women were actually making armor for the men too, and out of cloth. I mean, to me, it was just so interesting. Yeah, I just got fascinated by the whole subject.
I wonder if that cloth armor got really heavy when it was wet.
Oh, it probably did. It
Probably
probably
not
did.
heavier than chainmail, though.
Well, no,
Yeah,
that's true.
not
I'm
as heavy
just,
as chainmail, and it would dry quick. It would dry pretty quickly.
yeah, you wouldn't have
Wool
to
is
clean
wool
it.
is- Yeah, yeah,
I actually read that they coated it with a varnish, which
Yeah, I
they
was
did have
wondering.
varnish
yeah.
at
Oh,
that
maybe,
time.
Mhm.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
and that would make it more waterproof and also, harder so that the arrows are more likely to bounce off of it.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
And
yeah.
maybe only, like some dogs who have thick coats, like the water doesn't, it
Right?
kind
It
of beads
doesn't
up and it doesn't
penetrate.
get all the
Yeah,
way down to the skin, and
yeah.
it insulates them from being cold and from being hot. And so
Well, that's
maybe,
wool too, though.
yeah.
Wool is an amazing thing. So even when it's sort of saturated, it will still keep you warm. I mean, I interviewed the a fellow who was the captain of the Ottar, one of the replicated ships, and he said that he would rather have that kind of woolen technology on than some of the really modern, high tech
Hmm.
fabrics that they use on ships today. He said that they were actually really good, those woolen garments. So I'm sure that maybe Gore-Tex, well, I'm not sure, but I would expect that Gore-Tex would probably outperform that, but still, wool actually did a pretty decent job.
Well, when I was a sailor, we always wore wool under our
Yeah,
Gore-Tex.
yeah,
But if
yes,
it's oiled wool too, I know at one time they sold oiled wool sweaters. I don't know if they still do, but the oil in the lanolin in the sheep
yes,
wool, it's naturally there. And if it's washed very carefully instead of, with detergent,
yeah,
that lanolin remains.
Well,
definitely.
living down here in the hot desert, I don't have a lot of experience with the wool. Everything here is like, how thin can I get something and still protect me from getting sun, burn and stuff. So yeah, I
Yeah.
love conversations about wool because I don't have any much personal experience with it.
Not count yourself lucky.
Yeah, and that brings to mind, like, I'm sure that when the Vikings were traveling in the East and eventually made their way to places, perhaps places like Baghdad, the heat
Mm.
must have just, I can't, it's kind of amusing to think of how they would have reacted to it. We don't have any records, but it is kind of fun to think about that.
And that one of my main male character in the book I'm working on right now, he hates the cold, which seems strange for a Viking man, but he sometimes thinks about what it would be like to go down to take that eastern road and wind up where it's someplace warm.
Yeah.
Well, and you were talking about how long it took to make a sail. So in my latest book, I have one of a female sailor risk her life to try to save a sail
Oh,
Wow.
cool.
because she
What?
knows exactly. And
Yeah.
that,
I
Great
find that's
idea.
believable because, a
Yeah.
sail was deemed to be a gift worthy of a king.
yes,
Yeah.
So Yes. So, I mean, this was a enormously valuable object. I mean, really. So I could see someone absolutely, yeah, risking
Yeah.
their life to save it. Sure.
Hmm.
Absolutely.
What a great detail. That's why people love your books, Johanna.
Yeah.
From this point until 59 minutes in, Heather will be talking about slavery in the Viking Age. She will also be discussing the research she did of the women taken into slavery by ISIS fighters in our modern world. She did this research on these modern women to better understand how it might have been for female slaves in the Viking world. She does not go into graphic detail, but it is an upsetting topic, so we wanted to give you, our listeners, warning of the conversation to come.
Well, Heather, you have a very moving chapter about enslaved women. And in it, you describe the living conditions female slaves likely endured, including in the weaving sheds. So, would you share some of that with us?
Yeah. It was a really obvious, it was a really difficult life. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And the difficulties started even before they arrived in Scandinavia. If they were foreign slaves, there were domestic slaves too, but there were a lot of foreign slaves. Just very briefly, those foreign slaves were often women who were taken captive during by Viking raiding parties who were traveling, to the British Isles and basically attacking villages, and then basically they would separate the women and the men, and they would survivors anyway, the survivors, and the men and the boys who are old enough to, defend a village, they would be executed often. They could be executed right in front of the women. And then the women were then transported to to a nearby Viking camp, and held there for a period of time, and then subject to sexual assault there, I'm afraid, and then transported across Europe to Scandinavia. And in Scandinavia, they could be sold in a variety of places. There were no, as far as we can tell now, no slave markets in Scandinavia, but they could be sold just about anywhere, a harbor, a beach market, a fair, that kind of a thing. So once they were in Scandinavia, they were these slaves were put to work in very menial, monotonous tasks like grinding wheat or cereal grains into flour. That was a task that was undertaken by women. They were also put to work, in the fields, very lowly, monotonous work, milking cows, and so on. And they were, given very poor accommodation. They were not well fed, and they were subject to sexual assault in in by their owners in Scandinavia. If they tried to reject the sexual advances of their owners, they could legally be beaten. If they, let's say, stole food because they were hungry, their owner could cut off one of their ears. If they were caught stealing a second time, they could lose their other ear, and the third time the owner was entitled to basically hack their nose off. So mutilation was a punishment for things that women slaves did just to survive. So it's pretty grim. The weaving sheds, women were were put to work in these weaving sheds, and the weaving sheds were very small. They had a little hearth to stay, to keep warm. But the sheds would have been filled with wool fibers. Wool fibers would have been in the air, and the women were probably not allowed to really spend a lot of their time outside the shed. They were supposed to be working in the shed, and so the women would have been coughing. It would have been damaging to their lungs to spend long periods of time in the weaving sheds. And it was a very difficult life in Scandinavia. There's no question. And so, but as I say, the difficulties start at the point of capture, and then in the human trafficking chains of that they were passed along through, and it was a difficult life. Yes.
Very much so.
I
Mhm.
remember the one of the sagas, I forget the name of the saga with the woman Melkorka. She was an Irish
Mm.
princess. And
Yes.
when I forget his name, probably Thorkel or Thorstein or something, since it
Well,
was an
something.
Icelandic
Yeah.
saga.
I'm sorry, and I've forgotten his name too, but no, of course,
Yeah,
remember well.
he sees her and she's for sale, and but she doesn't speak.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking, well, of course she doesn't speak. She's a slave. And then he takes her back, and his wife doesn't want her in the house, so he sets up her own little house and gets her pregnant with a son who becomes Olaf the Peacock. But the thing that struck me about that story was the fact that she refused to speak until she was speaking to her son.
Mhm.
And I thought that was really telling. And it was, to me, it was a sense of like, she's going to protect herself. Like, this is the one I can control this part.
Exactly.
I
That's
can
the
not
one
speak to
thing.
these people. I
Mhm.
can do this. And
Mhm.
yeah, that story, I always was taken by that particular story.
Yeah, I was really taken by that story too, and I agree. It's the one thing that she could kind of control, that she could refuse, and that she couldn't be beaten for. But I mean, as soon as she was, as soon as she was kind of hidden away in this wooded area, and she would talk to her son. Yeah, I found it really quite moving actually, and it seemed to me that if any of the sagas had been composed by a woman, that this saga might
Mm,
have been one of them, because it seemed to, there was a certain sensibility there, a certain kind of observation, and a kind of a sympathy there that I
mm.
don't know, I haven't often seen in some of the other sagas that I've read. So and I know that there is at least one saga specialist who has suggested that that one may have been composed by a woman.
So, there's another story that you talk about in your book, and it's based on a paper by a past guest of ours, the archaeologist Marianne Moen, and she sheds new light on the motivation of the enslaved teenage girl who volunteered to be a sacrifice in a
Mhm.
Viking chieftain's burial. So this
Mhm.
story was recounted in Ibn Fadlan's famous account of a Viking funeral that he witnessed in the early 10th century on the Volga River. You talk about how Moen and her co-author wrote that a girl elevated by her own courage
Mhm.
to a position of respect into the company of the gods. So that kind of goes along with this whole story of Melkorka about how an enslaved woman could find a way to cope with her circumstances. Maybe you could
Yeah.
tell us a little more about that.
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, part of that came out of the work I did, and I don't know if you want me to talk about it or not, about the ISIS, the
Yes.
experiences. Okay, so maybe I'll just back up a little bit, because I really felt like I still wasn't getting a kind of a sense of what enslavement meant from the woman's
Mm,
point of view. It really bothered me. I would hear people talking about it, but it was always from the point of view of, the slave traders and so on, the men. But I wasn't getting a really good picture from the women's point of view. Little glimpses in the Melkorka story and so on, but what I did finally is I decided to look for first person accounts that have been gathered from women who've experienced human trafficking and sex slavery. So I found accounts of this, first person accounts, in a report compiled by the United Nations Human Rights Council. So the council interviewed women who had been captured and enslaved by ISIS fighters who had basically captured villages in northern Iraq in 2014. They had swept out of the mountains these insurgents, and they had captured these villages that were inhabited by the Yazidi people. The Yazidis were members of a religious community that was not Muslim, And ISIS captured these communities, and they basically did very much what the Vikings did. They killed the men and the older boys, and they took the women, and they basically sold them to ISIS fighters. And so the women were sold to ISIS fighters, and there's these terrible accounts of the women waiting in the holding cells, waiting to be sold. And they hear, the jangling of a key or just a footstep in the hall. And the women, there's this wave of terror that runs through the holding cells because they think someone's going to come in and take away one of their daughters. And when this, in fact, does happen, ISIS fighters show up and then they look for women. Then mothers are holding on to their daughters. They're screaming. The women are screaming as the daughters are being dragged out of there. And then the Human Rights Council documents, interviews the women about what their life was like with the ISIS fighters, what was happening, and the women describe their lives, which is pretty terrible. And it's almost daily sexual assaults and very, very difficult circumstances these women were in. Sometimes they were in the apartment with the ISIS fighters and their families. Sometimes the ISIS fighters had them in separate apartments, but they were locked in. So the Human Rights Council had a very detailed report on this. And then what happened was in 2017, a medical team led by Dr. Yakov Hoffman, he and his team interviewed, I think it was 118 Yazidi women who had survived slavery. They were in resettlement camps, and they went in, they talked to the women, and they did an assessment. Dr. Hoffman was a specialist in trauma, and he and his team interviewed the women. And what they found was that 72% of the women out of the 118 that they interviewed were experiencing PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, but 51% were experiencing the most extreme form, something called complex post-traumatic stress syndrome. And this left them, with feelings of worthlessness. A lot of these women had really vivid flashbacks and terrible nightmares and dreams about what had happened to them. And a lot of them were suicidal. They thought constantly about suicide. And so what those two reports showed is the sense that these women were absolutely broken and shattered by their experiences of slavery. And I think that we need to know this because so often the Viking raiders and raiding parties, they're seen as these kind of freebooting, kind of admirable, kind of exciting, what an exciting, adventurous thing to do. But there is a completely other side to this, which is that the women that they captured and as slaves are just destroyed by this slavery. So, sorry, that's kind of a long-winded way. In answer to your question about Marianne Mullen's, theory, and by the way, it's from a paper that she co-authored with Matthew Walsh too. I should just say that.
Thank you.
And this idea that this young teenage girl, 14 or 15 years old, she's a slave in this household of a Viking chieftain in Russia, and they ask who will die with him. They're just one simple question: who will die with him? And they've got all the female slaves of the household there. Who will die with him? And this young 14 or 15-year-old girl, I just read this. She steps forward and she offers herself, basically, I will. As soon as she makes this decision, her life in terms of it, material comforts improves dramatically. So she is given 2 slaves of her own. She spends her days drinking alcohol and she singing songs, and she makes no attempt to back out of the agreement. She has made up her mind. She is willing to do this. And so on the day of the ceremony, the funeral ceremony for the Viking chief, interestingly enough, they've towed a ship onto land, and they're going to use that as the burial chamber, just as people did with Joseberg women, which is quite interesting. But anyway, so the burial chamber is all ready. And this young slave girl is, first of all, they lift her up. They built kind of a threshold, a doorway a wooden doorway, and they lift her up, and she looks, and she tells them that she can see her father and her mother and a green field beyond, and it's a very happy moment for this girl. And they lower her down, and I don't really want to talk about too much about the exact method of her death, but it is very, very grisly and gruesome, and it is like she suffers a death that's akin to a death on a ritual battlefield. Basically, she's sort of stabbed and strangled and all kinds of things. So the idea, Marianne and Matthew's idea about this is that A, she's elevated by her choice, by her willingness to die. It's as if she is being in the Viking community. She is being treated like the wife of a Viking chieftain. She's elevated by in that sense socially during the remainder of her lifetime, which isn't very long, but she is treated like an elite woman, and she's given these slaves and freedom to spend her day as she chooses. But by her death, by her choice of death, it is as if she's one of the valiant Norse warriors who dies on the battlefield. And those Norse warriors who die on the battlefield, the belief was that they would go to the Valhall, the hall of Odin, the god Odin, and they would spend their evenings feasting in the great hall, in Odin's great hall. And that, so this young woman, by her horrible death that she actually endures, is elevated into the company of the gods, in the next world. And I thought it's a really interesting way of thinking about that scene, because most researchers have just thought about that scene as this helpless victim, and isn't it awful? Yes, it's awful. But again, this young girl makes a choice. She's able to take control of her life once again, even if it's only for a short period of time. And she demonstrates her bravery and her courage and is elevated into the company of the gods. So I found that quite moving, actually.
Very much so.
Yeah.
That's one thing I really love about what's happening in scholarship today is that we're reframing some of what we've already learned. Taking a story like that, that's just like
Yeah.
people have just taken like, well, this is just given that this is what it is, and looking at it in a different way. And I really like that people are starting to
I
It
agree with
reveals
you.
think
more
about it.
about their culture.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. I think too, and my thinking about this is that when I first started writing about archaeology, and 40 years ago, I'd go to conferences and there were hardly any women there. There were hardly any female archaeologists. And over the last 40 years now, I go to conferences and there's tons of women there. And I think it's really benefited archaeology. It's brought in a whole other perspective. Women are asking questions like, hey, what about the women? What were they thinking about? Or how would this play out from their point of view? And so I think this is what is happening in the field of archaeology. Certainly when it comes to studying the Viking age, people are starting to do this. And I think it's really important. And I think we're learning so much more because they're asking questions. They're kind of taking off the old blinders about what women were probably doing during the Viking Age, and they're just asking questions, and they're looking for the answers to those questions. So I think this is giving us a whole new understanding of Viking women.
It can also give us another perspective on Viking men too.
Yeah.
By, well, that they're, yeah, by really getting into the minds of women, it sheds new light on the whole society.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I really think it does. I'm not saying that all Viking men were part of the human trafficking rings and abused women. I'm not saying that, but it certainly happened. And slaves were abundant, and they probably weren't all that expensive. Not prohibitively expensive. So they didn't treat them well. They worked them hard, and they probably didn't treat them all that well. We do get accounts of some Viking lords giving their slaves freedom. I was thinking, and boy, I guess I'm a kind of a cynic, but I was thinking to myself, well, what a good way to make sure that your slaves work really hard. You say that the hardest working slaves, I'm going to give you your freedom in 2 or 3 years' time. If you work really hard and don't give me any trouble, kind of thing, then you're going to get your freedom. So my sense is that, I guess I'm a bit cynical now about about what I see in the historical record, and I think to myself, there might be another way of reading that generosity.
I know that a lot of times they actually would work off their slavery like an indentured servant. There were cases of that, and there were legal methods by which you declared someone a free person. There was a ceremony, and you had to have witnesses to it.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. I mean, it's interesting because we do have, and goes back to the written record that the Vikings produced themselves. We have these stones, rune stones, in which there are inscriptions about freed slaves, but we don't have very many. There aren't all that many about freed slaves, but there are some, and I think there is 8 or 9 that they have found with mentions of freed slaves. I could be wrong about that, but I think just one for a freed female slave. So I mean, I think I don't know what the percentage would have been, but my guess is that it was probably a smaller number of women than men.
Well, the women might not have survived as long because they would be getting pregnant and having babies, which was a very dangerous thing for them to be doing in that time period. So there's that too. In addition to the work.
Yeah.
They had that extra pressure on their not pressure, an extra.
Well, the exposure to the,
exposure to danger.
Weeping, all those things.
Yeah. All right, so we've discussed warriors, slaves, weavers, and sorceresses. There's even more that women did. So can you talk a little about women traders in the Viking Age?
Yeah, and this again was something that I really loved. I've got to say, this is a subject that warmed my heart because I don't think the sagas give us any examples of female traders. I did talk to an archaeologist about this who had looked at the subject quite extensively, and she said she didn't think there were any examples of female traders in the sagas. So to the best of my knowledge, there aren't. But what happened was, when this goes to my point about women coming into the field of archaeology in the 1990s, or late 1980s, this female archaeologist in Scandinavia, Anne Stalsberg, got really interested in the idea that there might be, what she called trading women. She didn't want to call them Viking traders or Viking merchants, but she would call them trading women. And so what she did was she decided to look at the burial records from one of the early Viking towns, which was Berka in Sweden. And Berka was a place that had been extensively excavated. There are something like 1,100 graves that have been excavated in Berka now, and very good detailed records of a lot of these graves. And so what Anne Stalsberg did was she went through the burial records looking for female burials that can, looking for burials with weighing equipment. So this would be scales or little lead weights or so on that would be used by merchants. So the Vikings, I should just backtrack 1 minute to say that the Vikings had a metal weight economy. So that means that if you wanted to buy something, let's say you were at a market of some sort and a merchant there had a piece of jewelry that you thought was really beautiful and you want to buy it, you might say to the merchant, well, I'd like to buy this and I'll offer you, a certain weight of silver. And the merchant would say, okay, that sounds reasonable. So the merchant would then, he or she would then pull out a pair of portable scales and put, the weight that you'd agreed on. Let's say it was 10 grams. They didn't use the grams, but I'm going to use them just for 10 grams of silver. So they put a weight equivalent to 10 grams on one side of the scales. And then on the other side, the buyer puts his or her silver. And when the weights are balanced, that's the set amount. And so scales were absolutely essential equipment to traders and the little weights that went along with them. So when Anne Stalsberg got interested in merchants and traders, she looked for burials that in which there were which pieces of trading equipment were found, and whether it's scales or weights. And then what she did was she found 118 I think it was 118 of these burials in roundabout there anyway. And what's really interesting is that she then found that 32% of those burials with trading equipment belonged to women, and only 28% belonged to men, and the remaining 40% belonged to couples buried together or to individuals who could not be identified by sex. So what her work tells us is that about 1/3 of the individuals buried with weighing equipment who, and this is an indication of being a merchant. If you take that as being an indication of being a merchant, 1/3 of those individuals were females. So even though the sagas don't mention anything about female traders, archaeology gives us this insight that indeed women may have been trading. And it really makes sense. And, traders had to travel often to faraway places. In the East, they were traveling along the river systems of Eastern Europe and Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and so on, to buy goods abroad and so on. And wouldn't it make sense to have a husband and wife working together as partners in case somebody got sick or, somebody in the worst case got killed? Then the merchant house would still have a representative there, like you could still continue. So it actually makes a lot of sense. And in fact, when Anne Stalsberg looked at the Viking settlements along some of the water roads in Russia and Ukraine, she found that, again, weighing equipment in the burials of women. So it does seem like women were playing a part in these places as traders. So I found that really fascinating. I really did. And it's sort of this untold chapter of the Viking world.
It is fascinating. Well, you talked about the warrior women being your favorite earlier,
Yes.
and I said we'd get back to that, and so we have.
One of my favorite topics.
Yeah, saving the best for last. Tell us what you've discovered about warrior women, and of course, BJ 581, who I've come to think of as a friend.
Yes, me too. Me too.
Yeah, she's so interesting.
She is.
I'm fascinated by your theory that she may have been an equestrian archer, and I want to know more about that too.
Okay. Well, I have to say that that's not my theory. That is the theory of a Swedish archaeologist, Charlotte Hedenstierna Johnson. And so I credit where credit's due. It's not my theory, but it's something that she suggested to me, and it makes a lot of sense. Okay, in this grave, so this warrior woman was buried in Berka, as well as being a center of trade. Berka also had a military garrison. And I think the military garrison was there to basically protect the trade. Very important. You can't have bad guys coming in and trying to take over the trade in this trading town. So anyway, there was a military garrison. And in a grave that was very close to the military garrison, archaeologists found human remains. And they found 2 horses. I think it's 2 shields, 2 spears, and a big handful full of armor-piercing arrows. So there was a lot of this individual had a lot of weapons. Initially, well, for long decades, for more than almost a century, that grave was considered to be the grave of a male warrior. Century and a half practically. That grave was considered to be the grave of a male warrior. But in around 2014, 2015. People start to raise their serious questions are raised about that because people are looking at the skeletal remains. They look like the skeletal remains of a woman based on the shape of the pelvis and various anatomical features of the pelvis. So this individual was the subject of DNA studies, and the DNA studies showed that this individual was a female, was a biological female. And so very interesting. So I found this fascinating because, again, the picture that Viking poets had created for us of what a battlefield must have been like, the horror of it, and just the level of violence of hand-to-hand combat is just, it's hard to even watch the scenes when you see them recreated in movies, but to actually experiencing the smell and the terror, the emotional state and all kinds of things, it must have been horrific. So, I wondered, how was the playing field leveled in some way? How do women manage to level a playing field like that? Because you'd think that a very strong, muscular young man would have a really big advantage on the battlefield like that. How can a woman survive for very long on battlefields like that? And the theory that Charlotte Heather Johnson came up with, and I think it's really interesting. She actually had excavated in the military garrison. She had discovered in that garrison that the warriors had really been very quick to adopt some of the weaponry and military techniques of warriors in Russia, on the plains of Russia. They had developed an interest in mounted archery and so on in that garrison. There was evidence of that. When she started looking at what was in that grave, the objects that were in that grave buried with that woman, the woman was buried seated on a saddle. So she appeared to have been kind of propped up and seated on a saddle. She was buried with two horses, as I said. She was buried with a handful of arrows. I think there were 28 armor-piercing arrows, as they were. And she was wearing this Eurasian style of riding jacket. That was the kind of the jacket that that was very popular among men, cavalry fighters in Eurasia. And in Eurasia, there was a long tradition of women warriors fighting on horseback. I mean, there's the old tradition of the Amazon women. Women had been buried in Ukraine and in parts of Russia in centuries preceding the Viking Age, many centuries preceding the Viking Age. But you wonder if there weren't stories told about these warrior women. Anyway, Heather Johnson's idea was that maybe this woman was fighting as a mounted warrior, and I got really interested in this idea. I thought, wow, that strikes me as possible. So it just turned out that I knew someone who was training in mounted archery, a woman who is a DNA expert in Europe, Angela Grafen, who I just saw from her Facebook post that she was training as a mounted archer. And I thought, gee, I'll have to ask her about it. Is it possible? What does she think about this? So I got in touch with her, and she thought it was very plausible. And she pointed out that in the Olympics, many of the equestrian events are events that women and men compete together. They compete as one kind of class. And so she thought it was very possible, and that it could have leveled the battlefield. She wanted to see more evidence. She felt like more evidence was still required, but it was at least an intriguing idea that she wanted to learn more. So it is possible that some women were actually fighting on horseback and serving as cavalry in some of the battles that the Vikings fought in Scandinavia and elsewhere. So I found that fascinating. Really fascinating.
I love that theory.
Yeah.
I read her papers about the Birka garrison, and now that makes so much sense.
Yeah. Yes, it does.
Well, and in most of Scandinavia, at least at that time, the Vikings didn't really fight from horseback. So it would have been an unusual technique that she would have adopted from the Eastern influence.
Yeah. And, the garrison people were, traveling, they were protecting the merchants on the river roads. So there were warriors that were protecting those trade routes. They're very important trade routes to merchants who are probably based in Birka. So, it's very possible that she was, fighting battles in Russia. It's certainly possible that she might have been traveling those river routes and protecting merchants along there. So
Hmm.
Yeah,
It's a cool idea. I liked it a
It,
lot.
very cool.
Yeah.
oh, wow. Whew. That's a lot.
Yeah.
So I know it's been a while. We had another question about your writing routine. Do you have time to go over that
Sure,
and to
sure.
let us know what you're working on next?
Sure, sure. I mean, the writing routine is pretty basic. I mean, I spend a lot of time research. I do love research, and it's probably the most fun part of the work that I do.
You're
And I
among
love
friends here with that.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I love diving down rabbit holes. And sometimes what you find in a rabbit hole is really interesting.
Hmm.
And that's how I found Amy Lightfoot and her work as a textile person and so on. So, I dive down rabbit holes quite often. But as a routine, I mean, I have a very, pretty strict routine when I'm writing. I write from 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm at my desk by 9 usually, and I write right through till about, I don't know, 5 p.m. a lot of days, but I take a break
Wow.
at noon. I take an hour and a half at noon, and I go for a walk my dog, and just relax for a bit, and then I come back to it, and I put another big block of time in the afternoon, and I try to do that. I only work on weekdays. I don't work on weekends, and I find I really need to have that strict routine because I find I can really procrastinate. I'm like a lot of writers. I'm a great procrastinator. And if I don't have that kind of strict routine, then I can really not get things done. Not get things done. So I try to stick to that routine. And as for what I'm working on right now, I'm switching. I've decided to switch. I've finished after 4 decades of writing nonfiction. I've decided I'm going to try something completely different. I'm I'm going to try writing a novel, and the novel I'm working on is set in modern times, but it is still related to the archaeology world. So there is an archaeological connection to it, but it is definitely set in modern times. I'm not going back in time. Except to the 1990s. I have an opening section that's set in the 1990s, but it's a modern day story that is looking at the archaeological world. So yeah, and it's
Hmm.
fun, but I'm finding it challenging because I'm having to learn how to write in a completely different way. And it's you can teach an old dog new tricks, but the old dog sometimes takes a while to get the new trick. So anyway, so
I have another friend who had been a writer and an editor, magazines
yeah,
for decades. And when he was in his 70s, he decided he was going to start writing fiction. And, he thought he knew the whole thing. And he was very familiar with what he was writing about.
yeah.
But he says the same thing as you. There's so much to learn about writing fiction that's not the same.
Oh, it's not even close to the same. It's not.
Yeah.
So I have great admiration for both of you women because you're doing that and you're producing really interesting novels, and yeah, I'm in kind of in awe of that. But I don't know, Joanna confided to me or mentioned in an email that she'd spent 6 years working on her first novel. And that made me feel good. But then I thought about it and it made me feel like, oh my heavens, am I going to be working on this for 6 years?
Probably not.
No.
Well, I don't
I
know.
had to learn all
Maybe.
about the Viking Age. I knew very little about it.
Well, you both know a lot about, you seem to know a lot about it now, I would say. So
I've
you
learned.
really, yeah, of
Mm.
course you have. You've had to. So, yeah.
It's fun though. It's fun to create
Mm,
worlds and characters and yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, even as we were talking, I jotted down like three ideas like, oh,
yeah.
this would be good in my current book that I'm working on. Oh, this would be a fun little short story about something that and that's when it's just like, oh, this is the magic of
It
writing.
is.
Oh
It's
yeah,
totally magic.
definitely. Definitely. Well, it'll be fun then when I read your novels, your current novel, in the future, then I'll maybe see something and I'll think, "Oh, we talked about that." Maybe
Yeah.
that. So that's great. I mean, I love that idea that maybe someone's takes that and runs with it or something. That's great.
hmm I'll give you a hint. It was the battle magic.
Oh yeah, that is a good one. That
It
is.
is. It is.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. That was just wonderful and so much information.
Yeah,
Yes,
sorry.
thank you.
Yeah.
That's
Maybe
great.
information overload, but yeah.
Hey,
I've
well, it's a podcast. People can come back and re-listen to it or take their time. And yeah,
And so can we. That's the nice
yes,
thing.
exactly.
Well, I've really enjoyed talking to both of you, and I just thank you for your interest and good luck with your novels. Like I say, I'm in awe of both of you for being able to do what you do. I really am. I'm not convinced that my novel will ever see the light of day, but I have hopes, but I don't know. But anyway,
Well, best of luck and keep us
Yes,
posted because I'd love to
definitely.
read it.
yeah. Well, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, when you do, you'll have to come back on and tell us all about it.
Yes.
Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, K.S., at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.